Hello, you massively overfunded nerds. I'm Mulder, and today we're going to talk about nostalgia. A few years ago, I really wanted to become a detective. I wanted to go out there and solve murders and crimes and whatnot. I didn't want to be a beat cop or anything. I didn't want to go out and write parking tickets. I wanted to be good, a do-gooder, beat evil, fight bad guys. Agent Mulder, solving crimes. I grew up watching a lot of crime shows, or what's called police procedurals. Things like NCIS and Criminal Minds and all the other latter ones. I always found it fascinating to become a crime fighter. I mean, yes, you hear terrible things about riot cops and police brutality and so on, even in my feeble young mind, but I wasn't gonna be any of those people. I was gonna be a good cop. A nice cop. I'd only do good. Act good. Like a good girl. For a time I even considered becoming a private detective until I found out that most of what they do is find out if one person is cheating on another person. It's not really crime fighting, is it? But then of course I started to grow up. I started seeing that the instrument of the police is something that is less do good and more often protect the interest of the state and the wealthy. If I actually wanted to provide a universal good to the world, I'd have to do something else. So of course I tried to join the military because apparently my brain just hadn't completely figured it out yet. The reason for both of these wants is because of my perception of the profession. I thought, watching these shows, that being a detective meant I would go around in a nice big coat and I'd solve crimes, and that was basically what I would do all day. After all, solving murders is universally a good thing, I think, unless Twitter has come up with some sort of new discourse, in which case, I don't want to know about it. Stop adding me. But of course that's not what police do, entirely. But if you were watching shows like these, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they do. And this has led some people to criticize these shows, saying that they are cop propaganda. Unfortunately, the analysis that I've seen in a lot of places have sort of started and stopped with cops are bad, the man wants people to think good of cops, the man gives money to Hollywood, Hollywood makes cop movie. People like cop now. And I don't think that's how it works. And even if it was how it worked, I don't think it would actually get to the root issue here. Why do these shows exist? And why do they portray the police the way they do? But of course, this is a Mia Mulder YouTube channel, so of course, we have to start this conversation talking about... Did you know that nostalgia used to be a medical condition? It's true. A medical student discovered that Swiss mercenaries fighting abroad would have some weird illness. They wanted to go back to Switzerland. They would be out for long stretches of war, and they would simply long home for their mountains, their sonorous songs. It was seen as something you could treat medically, and for a long time it was seen as something that only really affected the Swiss. But eventually people realized that anyone who leaves their home for any sort of extended period of time experiences nostalgia. And this is where it sort of transitions from being a medical diagnosis to becoming an emotion. An emotion that, by the way, wasn't fully described until just a few hundred years ago. Nostalgia simplified is a fondness of the past. It can be useful to improve your mood, make you feel connected to your environment, and be a nice comfort. It's more than just remembering the past. It is having a fond connection to it. But it's also possible to be nostalgic for things that you don't actually remember or have experienced. It's possible for nostalgic content to be able to conjure up the emotions of nostalgia in its audiences. Like, for example, the work of Wes Anderson. I've been consuming a ton of nostalgic content recently. Have you seen the Grand Budapest Hotel? I have. It's one of the best movies ever made, and it is steeped in nostalgia. If you haven't seen it, I won't spoil it too much, but I will mention some things in it, so, you know, beware. The Grand Budapest Hotel is a movie that deals with a lot of nostalgia. The narrative is told to us through the perspective of a present-day girl reading a book that is written in the 80s, detailing events that happened in the 1960s, which in turn are about the author interviewing a hotel owner talking about his life in the 1930s. As is the case with all societies, society in this movie is rapidly changing. It's actually the case of our society too, but because we're in it, we don't actually notice it that much. Within the time periods of the movie, no time period is exactly like the other. There are vast, drastic changes in both style and even aspect ratio. And, perhaps most importantly, the tellers of the stories fondly remember the stories they tell from the past. You could say that the entire premise of the movie is based on layers and layers and layers of nostalgia, even to a character who isn't actually telling a story at all. For example, the main character, Monsieur Gustave, upholds the fine, delicate elegance of the old imperial world of the Grand Budapest Hotel. And this is in a time when the world is rapidly becoming violent. To him, the regal elegance is a way to fight back against the violence that is currently changing the world that he exists within. A violence that is taking the form of fascism.
You're the first of the official death squads to whom we've been formally introduced. How do you do? How do you do?
The hotel owner, Zero, is nostalgic about the hotel that he inevitably inherits during the course of the events of the movie. He's nostalgic about the hotel because it reminds him of his late wife. I mentioned this to point out that nostalgia is neither good or bad as an emotion. It merely is an emotion. The movie portrays what is sometimes called reflective nostalgia, where you look back at your previous life or memories, think of it fondly, but you're critical of it. You try to find what is useful here. What can we learn from these stories? But I also mention it because nostalgia takes very different forms. There is the personal nostalgia of the hotel owner, but there is also social nostalgia of that of Monsieur Gustave. I actually considered remaking that entire movie shot for shot, but replacing the dialogue with something interesting like this. But then I realized that I am but one person and I have but one camera. Maybe this year I'll do something like that. Looking to the past with a sense of admiration is something that is today seen a little negatively. We are progressives after all. We look to the future. In modern discourse, social nostalgia like this is usually attributed to things like conservatism or nationalism, things of that nature. And don't worry, we'll get to nationalism. I'm not done with you yet. But from someone who is facing violence in the future, violence from, again, fascism, looking back to a time when, to them, the world was more peaceful, that is something that is way more understandable than the alternative. And we get this perspective from Monsieur Gustave. He just wants to vibe. He just wants to bathe in L'Heure de Panache and read romantic poetry. And honestly, who doesn't? If it weren't for all this senseless violence. Nostalgia eventually becomes part of romanticist art, and a very common trope in it. Especially during times when things are not great, so to say. This comes ahead during the Industrial Revolution when, for a lot of people, society became infinitely worse, at least for a few decades. From hindsight, sure, we can say that the Industrial Revolution was great for us, but it wasn't that great for the hundreds of thousands of workers who were now choking in coal dust in the air. And during this time, people became nostalgic for the time that came before, for a medieval sense of life. People longed to see art that would remind them of how things just used to be, when you could just drink from the rivers with no problem. Don't do that. This past would often be portrayed as better than it actually was. The medieval lifestyle before the Industrial Revolution wasn't actually that great. But since people were living in pretty bad society, they wanted the contrast to be as great as possible. If you're gonna have nostalgia, you're gonna have really good nostalgia. But this means that they also romanticized it. They made it seem better than what it actually was like. And so you may ask, what does this have to do with cops? From the perspective of a lot of people right now, things are pretty bad, especially when it comes to things like state violence and police violence. And while you could and should argue that this has been going on for a while, it is definitely a fact that for a lot of white people, this hasn't been obvious until fairly recently. Even if you want to stick your head in the sand and ignore it, that's very hard to do now. And so a lot of people are nostalgic for a time when they didn't have to care. Can't we just go back to a time when I didn't have to care about other human beings anymore? Before I had to think of state violence? I don't like thinking about this. Who's your manager? And that is nostalgia, but it is not reflective nostalgia. Instead, it is just romantic. They are just romanticizing about a past that they think existed. So we're going into this with a little bit of art history, which some people say isn't actually real history, said predominantly by people who don't study any history. To historians, art history is very useful because art usually survives time, and influential art usually survives even more. The same cannot be said for discussions though, unless people wrote them down, and God knows I'm not keeping an archive of my tweets. But art? Oh, people love that stuff. But history is messy. There are hundreds of ideas and they're all influencing each other, even if only a few of them are actually remembered. And many are forgotten, even though they did have a huge impact. A little bit like how Infiniminer led to the creation of a lot of Minecraft YouTubers. Coming from this perspective, let's discuss nostalgia and romanticism in relation to cop propaganda, or as it's more commonly known, copaganda. And it's a very good term. You can see what it means just by the combination of letters there. That's what a word is. What am I saying? However, the term propaganda implies intentionality, which I don't necessarily exist in this specific context. Propaganda is a term that is today associated with manipulative, coercive methods of convincing people of something. But historically, it's been a fairly neutral word. It simply means presenting information but with an agenda. The person who is showing you this information is doing it because they want something. They want to change your mind. Arguably, every single Mia Mulder video has also been propaganda. Copaganda is a term that refers to when news outlets and police stations do PR events, basically. Like when CNN shows cops kneeling with protesters, when MSNBC shows cops hugging the protesters together, when the police say, "We hear you, we see your plight. We know we need to do better," but there will be no charges filed. And of course they do this without actually taking any measures to fix the problems that they're currently trying to brush over. And the intentionality is obvious when police departments are doing it. They want to have a good image. The intentionality becomes slightly more muddled when news departments do it, but they usually have the intentionality of reporting big events at protests, and the police are doing this as a big event, so intentionality falls to the police again there. But with fictional shows, it becomes a bit more complicated. The history of police procedurals arguably stretches back longer than the institution of the modern cop do. The origins of the modern format exist in the mystery genre, with detectives solving a particularly tricky mystery. Think Sherlock Holmes, mostly private detectives or amateurs. But as the role of detective and street police became more entwined over history, so does the stories. Slowly, the mysteries turn into fighting crime. Some claim that the origins of the cop show is the Andy Griffith Show, featuring a sheriff in a small town doing sheriffy stuff. And it may be remembered as such due to its popularity, but that's not where the modern format has its origins. During early TV history, cops would often be seen as bumbling or corrupt. That is until Dragnet. Dragnet in 1949 portrayed police as heroic crime fighters, and they also used actual police equipment in the show for authenticity. This, however, meant that they had to have a good relationship with the actual police, as they were the ones who were lending them the equipment, and they were also the ones in charge of granting shooting permits. And this gave the police final powers over the script in exchange, and suddenly cops could be glorified. Which means that in the 1950s, cop shows were literal copaganda in the most direct sense of the word, because the cops had a direct influence on the script. They claimed that they were there to promote realism, when in actuality, those script consultants could easily hide negative or unwanted aspects of police portrayal on TV. But, you know, this is modern times. And now there are police shows that are a bit more independent. The show Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a police comedy show about the detective squad at the 99th precinct in Brooklyn. Most episodes are fairly basic. Crime happen, they go to solve the crime, have a bunch of goofs along the way, usually making fun of a couple of characters while they do it. Most of them don't actually deal with any deep issues. Most of the time they're just cops, doing their job but in a fun way. And some episodes don't even involve crimes at all, it's just the characters doing fun stuff. It's more about the characters, they just happen to be cops. And all of the events happen at the police station. Now, the creators of the show are realizing, oof, we're making a comedy show about cops. Maybe we should talk about some serious cop issues. The reason they want to do this is because the show prides itself on its wholesome niceness, on its inclusiveness, on its good moral compass, on its wokeness.
Get woke, Scully!
And that's why they've been doing more episodes talking about things like police brutality, racial profiling, sexual harassment. And it's a good thing that they are discussing those issues. Obviously, cops should be not doing those things. But what is happening is it is a romantic view of how the police could be. We've always seen the show as a fantasy of what we would like the world to look like. Wouldn't it be amazing if there was a precinct like the 99? This core group of detectives that has the moral compass you would wish for and is truly diverse and represents a lot of different people? If you watch shows like this, you may be forgiven for thinking that the problem is about moral compasses and diversity. And obviously, I would like it if more cops had a good moral compass, and having more diverse police departments is probably better than not having diverse police departments. But those things are, to a point, only aesthetics. They don't actually change how the police operate as an institution. Hello there. I am a cop. I exact brutal justice on all who cross my way. Or, depending on the media that you're consuming, I'm a bumbling buffoon who is also exacting perfect justice on everyone. Now, it should be said that, as a cop, Brooklyn Nine-Nine is far more realistic than most other cop shows. I mean, after all, we have flaws, we have fun at work, we're all a bit scampy. If anything, it's good that shows like this exist. It is dangerous to be a dashing cop and all. To go out there and face danger every day. I can't do that. I can't even pretend to be a cop, it's... ugh. However, we are at the halfway point now, and I can imagine that you want me to actually talk some crap about the show. I mean, it's in the thumbnail, so I have to talk about it. So let's finally dissect Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And don't worry, I'll cover my bases later in the video. But now we're just gonna go full critique. A key issue with Brooklyn Nine-Nine is that it tries to be apolitical something that is literally not possible. But they do it in order to cover as many bases as they can. They want to appeal to those who both like cops and also to people who may have criticisms of the police, so to say. They're not really discussing New York City policy. Jake Peralta isn't really advocating for the workers of the world. But that is still a political choice. It is only a choice in what they choose to omit. They are still cops after all. So the choice is about portrayal. The way similar shows have dealt with these issues is by having it be a core part of what the show is. It's not just special episodes discussing the issue. It is shown in the basic procedure of how the show works. The Barney Miller Show, for example, tried to portray a person trying to make a kind police institution, while still existing in society where that wasn't the case yet. Even the Andy Griffith Show tried to portray various progressive causes in the show itself too, even though they completely failed in doing so because they completely ignored the civil rights movement, something that Andy Griffith himself heavily regretted after the show was made. You can claim that Brooklyn Nine-Nine is not ignoring issues because they are making special episodes, but because of those issues that they discuss aren't actually woven into the fabric of the show, is that really true? Because unless they are woven into the fabric, they are merely aesthetic, and they are not constructive to the show overall, which is exactly the type of change that police precincts also want to do. An aesthetics change, rather than a structural one. And over time we start seeing certain elements of the show as being realistic, because they're not part of the comedy, they're just part of the delivery, or they only exist so that they can add to their wholesome vibe cop aesthetic. For example, most crime that they deal with is drug related, and they usually target distributors, but the real life war on drugs doesn't really look like that. The real life NYPD often deals with arresting far more common drugs in a lot more common people. And this is but one example of how the show operates, but that also informs our view of how the police should work, at least in fiction. There's also a part where they talk about defense attorneys as being the enemy.
You slept with a defense attorney. You literally slept with the enemy. I know.
Which is a bit yikes, considering defense attorneys are supposed to be the, right of everyone to have legal counsel. And also to make sure that the police just doesn't send anyone they want into jail because they think they got the right person. To call those people the enemy and have a sort of fight against them, positioning themselves as defending criminals and getting criminals off, that's a bit yikes for me, I think. Also, isn't it strange how there are so many shows about cops, but there aren't that many shows about prison guards or ICE agents? Practically, they are in similar areas of law enforcement. So what's the deal with not having a border patrol procedural? And sure, there are definitely shows about lawyers, but they are mostly about prosecutors, almost never about defense attorneys. Oh, but that wouldn't make good TV, you say. Well, and a show about cops would. I'd rather watch a show about firefighters. The only reason cop shows are so popular is because they have been normalized over time. Over time, the detective story has become stolen by police. That's stolen valor, I say. That honor belongs to Miss Marple. But if anyone actually made a show about the military or border enforcement or ICE, or any other type of state violence enforcer, we'd see the absurdity in doing that. We'd also see when it's not actually that funny. Because either it would be realistic, and then we would see the horror of that, or they would try to be unrealistic, like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But we all kind of know what the reality looks like in those fields. We don't actually know what the reality looks like when it comes to cops. And that's because we have decided that what we see in the news is the outlier, and what we see on TV is the norm. The show feeds into a more real-life narrative that when cops do their job, it's heroic and brave and it saves us all. When in actuality, good police work is most often boring, and bad police work is more common and more violent. So the show leads the viewer to think, well, not all cops are bad, because at least some of them have to be like Jake Peralta. It's individuals that are the problem, not the system. It's not a systemic issue, it's just a few bad apples. 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 And of course, the premise of the show couldn't exist without the idea of the cops being the good guys and the criminals being the bad guys. Sure, it's not doing amazing things with that writing. It's probably the most common trope that exists, but it's also a trope that is false. Unfortunately, the fact that the show ignores or makes light of real-life policing in Brooklyn means, purposefully or not, that it perpetuates a narrative that the NYPD wants perpetuated. The cops are the good guys, and bad cops are few and far between. It's a narrative that the events of the past week have revealed to be bullshit. Good guys don't drive SUVs into crowds. They don't spray tear gas at peaceful protesters to clear way for a presidential photo op. They don't attack members of the media, and they don't kneel on the neck of a citizen, ignoring desperate pleas that he can't breathe until he is dead. Brooklyn Nine-Nine puts all of your sympathies with cops whose real-life counterparts clearly don't deserve them. A lot of discussions about why the police are the way they are have to do with more modern inventions, such as police militarization, for example, which is a bad thing, yes, but it's not as if the police was somehow better before they were militarized. It stems from the cops. The problem may be even worse than I am portraying it here, because police procedurals are becoming way more popular now than they have been in recent years. And the contrast between fictional cop and real-life cop is growing more and more, which makes people nostalgic for the fictional police. And if your only exposure to the police was via media, then you may be nostalgic for the real police to be like the police used to be before. All of this police riot stuff is just recent. It's just recent though. It's not actually, it's just new. When you think about it, when was the police ever good? If you're nostalgic for an era when the police used to be better, I would have a hard time figuring out what you would be talking about. If you're talking about police militarization and you want to revoke that, which again is a good thing, the cops weren't exactly good before they were militarized either. Instead of tanks and sniper rifles, they still had hoses and attack dogs. Nostalgia figures into even how the human mind operates. So come with me to the wonders of the mind. Being nostalgic for a time that doesn't exist is sometimes used as a defense mechanism. When you're confronted with facts that contradict your worldview, then you suffer from cognitive dissonance. And one way that you can defend yourself against the uncomfortable feelings that you get from that is by being nostalgic. By falsely remembering how the past used to be like, you can change the entire world to fit with the narrative. Why am I hearing so much about police brutality now? Well, it's because the police used to be way better before. That's why. Remember in the 50s when you could just go down the street, you could ask a policeman for the directions and he'd give it to you. You could always trust your local neighborhood police officer. Yes, sir. It is, of course, a lie. Romantic nostalgia doesn't just exist when you think about the olden days or when people in the Industrial Revolution would not want to be in the smog anymore. Instead, it makes a huge appearance when it comes to romantic nationalism. Historically, romanticism was used to personify nations, to take cultural aspects and call them whatever you wanted to fit the ideal of the nation that you belonged to. All of these different folk tales, they're all German now anyway, because there is such a thing as German now. I'm doing all of this to make sure that my nation is better than all of your nations. Nostalgic romanticism makes its way into nationalism a bit more recently though. In a study from 2014, it was found that nostalgia can be used by politicians to sort of press on different insecurities to make them vote in certain ways. We've seen how this works both when it comes to people like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, using wildly different aesthetics, but still a variant of the same type of argument. They are both romantic for a version of the past. A version of the past, which for Donald Trump means law and order, and for Joe Biden means return to normalcy. Oh yeah, I can't wait how that's gonna turn out. This is what is known as restorative nostalgia, where you don't try to learn from the past in order to adapt to the future, you just want to make society like it used to be like. But it doesn't just happen with political direction. It's not a top-down thing. It can also happen because individuals, as we are, have a shared interest in thinking about the world in a certain way, especially when we have experiences that we all share together. When people think about the 1910s, people often think of the war. Hans, fire the secret button. The idea is that the war is something that we can remember. You know, the war is bad, but you know what? We won. We showed honor, bravery on the battlefield. We saved the war. And while no one is nostalgic for the war itself, they are nostalgic for the good feelings they had in connection to that war. But one thing that people weren't nostalgic for was the Spanish flu. You don't win against the Spanish flu. You just... In the decades after the Spanish flu, it kind of fell out of memory really quickly. It's only recently that the Spanish flu has been brought up to public attention because we are currently in a pandemic, so we start thinking about the other ones too. What I'm saying here is the very simple hot take that people want to remember good things, which to a lot of middle-class white people, the police probably were for a long period of time. If your personal experience with the police has been positive and you can see that universally that is not the case, you either realize that, oh, I have privilege, or you suffer from cognitive dissonance. And even if you do know that you had a good experience because you were privileged, doesn't necessarily keep you from being nostalgic anyway. There is the Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and then there is reality. Social nostalgia of this type can be a good thing, depending on what we are nostalgic about. If we are in a deeply wild time, it can be easy to be nostalgic for a time before everything just went to crap. That is why the return to normalcy is something that is very attractive to a lot of people. But when we're talking about the police, the nostalgia isn't actually based on anything real. It is based on a fictional representation that since Andy Griffith has never existed. There's probably someone out there watching this thinking, oh, can't you joke about anything anymore? And I should say, obviously I think that people can make fun of whatever they want to. I think it's very possible to make a comedy series featuring police officers. That's not the crux of the issue here. Satire about all sorts of evildoers is common and oftentimes very effective. If Brooklyn Nine-Nine was satirical of the police, then I probably wouldn't have this video. People probably wouldn't call it copaganda. The difference is though that the show, and others like it, don't actually satirize anything. In fact, a lot of them take it very seriously, which just exacerbates the problems that they're confronted with. Because if they want to discuss these issues, then they actually have to discuss them. You can't just be like, hey, oh, cops are your jakes, huh? Well, Racism is bad, but it's still good that they're taking it seriously though. They should take it seriously. But that it also narrows what kind of comedy that they can do without glorifying the subject matter that they are doing. I do want to say before the end though, that the show has definitely improved over the seasons. The show has become aware of its own impact and therefore tries to do something with it. So it's hard to say whether or not the show is copaganda or not. It may be more fair to say that it is maybe propaganda, depending on the episode. I do want to say, however, that amongst the cop shows that exist, Brooklyn Nine-Nine is probably the best one. If there are going to be cop shows, and from the looks of it, it's not going to change anytime soon, I'd prefer a cop show that at least has the self-awareness of having an episode that deals with an issue now and then. So while I'm critical of the concept, maybe there's a lesser evil lesson here somewhere. Oh no, I'm becoming a centrist, no! He's still a bastard though. The show is also way more socially aware now than it was when it started. The term copaganda only recently got very popular, especially in the last year. But by taking these discussions seriously, they're also acknowledging the harmful effects that the show is doing when they're not having these serious discussions. And this is something that I think had a lot of impact in their decision to take a break and revisit some episodes and really reevaluate the show in regards to its coppiness. But they're still making the show, and we're still gonna watch it. And this brings me to a really juicy morsel of content. Where is the intentionality here? Propaganda usually has an interest, trying to have an agenda imposed on the information that it's sending out. Like, I don't think that Andy Samberg is like, I'm gonna make a cop show and I'm gonna make everyone love cops. I don't think that there's a police commissioner sitting somewhere thinking, damn, there's a controversy again. Quick, call up Jake Peralta, he has to be funny for 15 episodes. I think it's also on us as an audience to recognize why shows like this exist. They exist because we watch them. We find them interesting. And the reason we find them interesting is, I think, because we recognize that there is a deep problem when it comes to the police currently. So the only recourse we have is to rely on fictional cops. Instead, police procedurals have become so desired that they're taking up more and more part of our network programming. Up to 22% of all scripted US TV was police procedurals, which is an incredibly high amount. The reason why people love these shows so much, I think, is because we watch them in order to cope. Even us who are critical of the police will romanticize them in order to at least have something to hold on to. The nostalgia becomes a defense mechanism to deny historical facts. And this is something that TV producers, and probably quite a few police precincts, have also caught up on and want to take advantage of. And I should say, the cast of Brooklyn Nine-Nine seem like a decent bunch of people. Most of them, anyway. They've shown their support for causes like Black Lives Matter and many of the protests that have been going on of last year. So, there's that at least. The content exists because we want cops to be better. We want good cops, and the only ones who's providing them to us is network television. But not only is that giving us a false version of policing, it's also satiating our need for change. That's not to say that you can't like these shows. I like Brooklyn Nine-Nine and I'm probably going to watch the next season when it comes out. But we need to be aware of the context that these shows exist within and realize that the shows are not in a vacuum. The actors are playing fictional characters, but the police on the street are real. Hi! I'm still here trying to make content in 2021, and a reason that I can do that is thanks to my sponsor for this video, Skillshare. You know them. They're the ones who have thousands of classes about all sorts of topics to help you boost your creativity and productivity. Personally, the ones that I've enjoyed have been Creativity Unleashed by Nathaniel Drew or Find Your Style by Andy J. Pizza. Both of these classes have helped me a lot coming into 2021 with a new sense of creativity and drive, especially since we're coming out of the last year with deep, dark, deepening existential angst. Skillshare is focused on learning, so there are no ads on the platform. And with an annual membership, it costs less than $10 a month. The first 1,000 people who click the link in my description will get a trial period of Skillshare Premium membership. Thank you. Hi, welcome to the credits. I'm going to talk here for a bit while the credits are going, and before I'm actually going to start saying names of patrons. But I'm going to do that in voiceover because I didn't write it down while I'm shooting this. I'm a big baby. Please forgive me. I just want to say that it's a new year. I'm very thankful for you watching this. If you are interested in watching more of my videos, please hit subscribe, hit the bell, hit the like button, leave a couple of comments. It doesn't hurt. I would really like if my channel kept growing this year. I'm doing great. I'm doing this as a full-time job still. And every view, every like, every comment helps this channel so much. If you like the video, you can even share it around on Twitter, on the socials. Show it to grandma or someone who likes Brooklyn Nine-Nine or the Grand Budapest Hotel. Also, go watch the Grand Budapest Hotel. It kicks ass. It's the best movie that exists. Okay, I'm gonna make another video for January this year, and that's coming out soon. I'm considering this to be my December video, so I'm looking forward to see how things will look for the new year. And take it easy. And now I'm gonna read Patreon names. So, okay. I'd like to give a special thanks to. That's a lot of names. Aini Salminen, Alicia Crawford, Alki Historiker, Amanda B, Athiet, Austin K, Autumn, Catherine Stenson, Christine Gutierrez, Cobrasphere, Dana Ferguson, Daniel Gollin, Emil Rutkowski, Emilia Clark, Aaron Kitchen, Fox Kant, Hannah Richards, Jade C, Jane Lusby, Janelle Torgesson, Jareth Arnold, Jim Sterling, Jonathan Wardrell, Jörgen Danielsen, Joshua Anolek, LPQ Silver, Linus 2.0, Melvin Sowa, Michaela, Morimer, Mountain Snow, Natalie Kapoor, Nia Pasaka, Nork426, Pat, Phobos2390, Rose Brunton, Riley Knox, Salmon Moose, Sitzrees, The Bread Santa, Thoros of Mir, Tiffany A, William Fu Hustle, Ultimate Sanctibus, Vinder, Vivian Crow, Wolfgang the Grand High Exalted Wizard, and Soya Kant. I also have a new plant. Oh no.